And then he adds on, be peace among yourselves. What does that happen? See, sometimes Paul understood this. So, the church needs leaders. Well, somebody says, I like so-and-so. He's so eloquent in speech. He dresses so nicely. You know, he's so musical. His voice is so soothing. And somebody says, no, I see this person over here that seems to be a man who can stand up to all kind of problems and pressure, a man who's not afraid to lead. And what can happen? Factions can develop. It's just like when a company is trying to choose a new CEO. They go after the most talented, the most able, a person within the company. One who has shown a lot of enthusiasm and grit and courage and all that. But in the church, it's very different. And just to explain to you very simply, when Paul says, and to esteem them most highly in love because of their work. You and I need some kind of evidence from this person who's desiring to be a leader in the church. That they know the Lord, they love the Lord. And they're not here to pander to their own ego. Because those who have that kind of desire, they are big into some power play. And that's always to boost themselves up. And it can be very destructive. I have seen churches destroyed because of bad leadership, poor leadership, leadership who have no regard for the spiritual things of God, are more about themselves than about Jesus Christ and His church. So Paul says, be at peace among yourselves. So, if they are going to esteem the leader most highly in love, you know how you can do that? You will have to know that leader. You'll have to find a way they stand with the Lord. You'll have to watch their behavior, their speech, their attitude, their action. And when you do it out of love, because of the care and concern for Christ, God will bless that church with a great leader. But then he says, be at peace among yourselves. So now, what has happened? Well, we look at a person, we may like him, how he talks, physically and all that. And there's always someone who's going to say, he looks nice, he talks good, but I'm not really all for that person. They have their own biases. Guess what the church has to do? You're going to esteem the person highly and in love. The congregation will have to spend time on their knees to pray. It's not always good for congregation to think, we choose the leader, we hire the leader. What is important for the congregation to feel the Lord's hand about the person that they are putting over them. And when you do that, guess what will happen? When God is involved, the first thing He does to our troubled hearts, He brings peace. Doing things God's way will bring the right kind of prosperity that the church needs. So for those who are led, the apostle begins with, now we ask you. You see, first he says, now we ask you in verse 13. In verse 14 he says, I urge and exhort you. There he gives an imperative, gives a command. This is what you need to do as a church. Sometimes some churches get so comfortable and say, the elders are preaching and they do a pretty good job, so why bother getting a pastor? We'll just continue, get this one to preach and that one to preach, and that one to preach, and that one to speak to us. That doesn't work. God chooses leaders. He chose Moses, Aaron, Joshua. You can go down the list. God chose His Son to lead us to Him. He says, for those who are led, to acknowledge and recognize their leaders. The request concerns three responsibilities: to acknowledge and recognize their leaders, to appreciate them highly because of their work, and to be at peace among themselves. To acknowledge them. Acknowledge, it's in an interesting grammatical syntax, infinitive of the verb oida, to know, acknowledge, recognize. Some understand this word oida, to know, in this context to mean appreciate and value. But this idea is found in the second request, to appreciate highly. There is a need in every congregation to become aware of and recognize those God has raised up in their midst, who perform the duties well. But they perform the duties not by just ability, but by their piety, or by their holiness, or by their Christian lifestyle. And also the other thing that comes from this passage is those that are chosen to lead would function through a heart that cares about others. You see, when you talk about it's what we can call inner leadership and demonstrate the fact that they are God's appointed leaders. The responsibility of the church then is first to discern and then to recognize such men, Acts 20:28, as their leaders. This would include a formal appointment to places of service and submission. At this juncture, let me say this very simply to you. One of the greatest joys in this church, in Upper Kingsclear, for me as a pastor, I have men who have great heart. One, they know the Lord. That doesn't mean they stop growing. They need to grow more. I as a pastor need to grow more in my walk and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. But the other thing I do find in the leadership in this church, to be men and women who care for one another. We had a visitor. She just popped in looking for a church. I don't know how she even got a lead to this church. Before she left, I went and saw her. Had a kind of a kinship with her. I was born in Africa, and so was she. She's been doing mission work in Africa, but because of COVID, she was home. Before she left, I went and said, thank you for coming, and just encouraged her. This is what she said. I'm so glad I came. This is a friendly church. I'll tell you, where the peace of Christ reigns, there will also be joy. But where there is turmoil, there will be no joy. She said, I've been to quite a few churches. Not one person turned around and said hello. She said, I walked in a stranger and walked out a stranger. How sad that that can happen in the Church of Jesus Christ. But guess whose responsibility it is to set the pace? Is the leaders. So I could say more about that, but I'm just going to move further. You know, he says, esteem them highly, those highly in love. And then he says, Be at peace among yourselves. And then he will go on to say to those who labor, this is how you need to treat them and encourage them and build them. In some churches, even where I've served, there were people in the pew who were literally discouraging people to come to church. In other words, they were not interested in the body of Jesus Christ, the church. They were interested in their influence and their power, so they could garner certain people behind them. For whatever reason they want to do that, that's between them and the Lord. But you know what? It never worked out well for them. So these instructions are very poignant for those who lead, as these verses give guidelines for those qualities that the congregation might look for in recognizing in the leadership. So they also provide wonderful guidelines for those who lead. In this, the apostle describes three things: those who labor, and those who preside over you and admonish you. They are to characterize the leaders. This is clear, for we have one article and three participles connected with and. Each of the participles are in the present tense, and in this context, the present aspect points that we should characterize the ministry of these leaders. Those who labor, those who preside over you. And many times that is neglected, as long as we get somebody who's going to tickle our ears, make us laugh, and we say, boy, wasn't that fun to be in that church? People, the body of Jesus Christ, yes, it can be a fun place to be, but that's not why we gather. We gather to lift Jesus Christ up. And this becomes the first responsibility of the leader. Like I said, the leader should never be called, and some churches prefer that, to be the CEO or to be the salesman and to be the frontier man. No. The leadership that a church should look for is one who's willing to bend his knees before God and then help people to know how to do the thing. Without that, you have lost out. And this church in Thessalonica was such a powerful church. So quickly they had grown amidst great persecution. And now they were still looking and they were searching for Paul to get some instruction. And Paul realized they needed some leaders to continue helping the people in their walk of faith. So then Paul will continue, as he says in verse 14. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, admonish the undisciplined, comfort the discouraged, help the weak, be patient towards all. See that no one pays back evil for evil to anyone, but always pursue what is good for one another and for all. Let me just, we're going to be looking at this verse again in the next message, but I just want to put it to you. Not only is the church called to choose leaders that will lead, but do you know, Paul here makes it very clear. Every born-again believer are to share in that work. Being in places where pastors are burning out, you can buy a dozen pastors who are burnt out. Why? Because the church expected him to do everything and neglected to carry out their part. Paul makes it very clear here. He says, and we urge you, brothers and sisters, admonish the undisciplined, comfort the discouraged, help the weak, be patient towards all. You see, it's not only the pastor to say, well, that person is doing wrong. And then you go and you confront that person, and then the family gets on your case.